Hi everyone. This is a sort of impromptu video that I'm putting together as a means of introducing people who don't have any sort of background in judo to a bit of the visual, the aesthetic. So the uniform that we're wearing and the belt system. It's basically what I'm going through here. Now, none of this is going to really be news to anybody who already does judo for reasons that should be obvious, and a lot of it will also seem pretty standard or pretty straightforward for people in a number of other martial arts, because as it turns out, there are common threads, at least when it comes to a lot of traditional Eastern martial arts. I'm not going to get into all the different exceptions because there are different styles or sub-styles of judo. There are different schools. Different schools sometimes have their own ranking systems that are a little different from what's conventional. I'm not going to get into all of that because I could spend hours talking about all that stuff. But this should serve as sort of an introduction to people on the outside who are looking in and maybe don't have any background in this and are curious about what they're looking at when they see people wearing certain uniforms and generally what the ranking system means. And I can talk about, say, just the ranking and progression in more detail another time, maybe exceptions to uniforms, that sort of thing. But without further ado, let's just talk about the uniform. The typical traditional uniform that's worn in traditional judo, which is a Japanese art, is called a gi. Now a gi, G-I, refers to a Japanese garment for, in this case, martial arts. So it's not just in judo, but also karate wears a gi. Jiu-jitsu, depending on the version, also wears a gi. Brazilian jiu-jitsu wears a gi, certain versions of Japanese jiu-jitsu. You will also see what's sometimes kind of erroneously referred to as a kimono, but there are different types of uniforms that are used that are not technically a gi, that are used in things like Aikido and some other Japanese arts. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. But in judo, we have a gi. And it's very similar to a karate gi. So if you've done a traditional karate style, some version of karate, and there are about 62 million different flavors of karate, kind of like there are with taekwondo, which I did for a number of years. But it's similar enough to that you should probably recognize how it's made. So I have my two main gis here. This is my blue one, which is the one I was wearing in the picture that inspired the logo for my channel, and tends to be the one that maybe people who look at me as a judo guy might identify me more with, if I can speak. My words will work. But basically, here's what we're looking at here. This is a very standard, very basic Fuji gi. Fuji is a great brand. You don't have to break the bank and spend $200 on a gi for it to last you. If you know how to take care of these things, they can last you a while. Every once in a while, maybe a seam will open up and you have to stitch it back, or you have a little tear somewhere, something like that. But if you wash them correctly and you're not totally reckless with them, they can last you a number of years. Maybe another time can talk about cleaning them and whatnot, and there are other videos on YouTube and all around the interwebs that go into different schools of thought on how to clean them and all that. I'm not going to get into that. But you'll notice that it's pretty thick. This is just a single weave. So you have double weaves, for example, and I think there are even triple weaves out there. But there are basically ones that have layers of fabric that are thicker than this. But this is thick enough. This is like a carpet. When I first put one of these on back in 2009, so yeah, almost 11 years ago, my first time putting on a gi, I said, wow, this is heavy and this is hot. So you're going to sweat. It is not uncommon, because these things are so heavy, to come out of a practice having lost several pounds in water, just from sweating it out. Now, that's not necessarily cause for alarm. I do highly recommend that people keep trying to replenish their fluids throughout their practice, and certainly right after, and to drink throughout the day and all that, so they're not already kind of underhydrated or dehydrated before they go in. Again, topic for another day. But this is your standard gi. And if you look at it, see, it just hangs like this. Sometimes people will call this a gi top or the jacket, but this is just, of course, the top half. It folds in the front. Traditionally, it would be left over right. So I would look like this. This is why on all my photos, if I have it all the way closed, my left side is over the right. And you'll notice there's a sort of seam pattern in the back where it's reinforced along the shoulders, and again, a little pattern down below around what's called the skirt often. So this is the part that kind of flares out at the bottom around the belt line. So there you have it. That's a gi. Now they're sized typically in either whole numbers or halves. So this is a size 4 for Fuji, and I'm an odd shape in that I kind of have long arms, but I don't have a long torso. I have a kind of short torso for my height, but I'm also thick enough in the chest and shoulders that I need a big enough gi to accommodate that. But then sometimes I get like a torso length issue, or something doesn't fold in the front. People who watch my videos or sometimes comment and say like, wow, you're this thing flapping open all the time. It's not intentional. It's just because they don't necessarily hang on me just right. You can get these tailored. I'm far too broke for that, so I just wear these. Again, if you take good care of these things, they can last you a long time. And I've had this one for about 4 years, I want to say, and it's still going pretty strong. It's still hanging in there. The pants, which I'll get to in a second, are, I think, a little bit more of an issue in terms of keeping them together. Sometimes because people will grab the pants when you're fighting on the ground. If you're doing jiu-jitsu, or if you're doing a version of judo where you're allowing leg grabs and all that, then it can happen during stand-up. But seams can come open, especially stuff around the waistline, at least in my experience. These are the pants right here. You will have different types of drawstrings, but they typically all have some kind of a drawstring with a loop in the front, sometimes a couple of loops. If you look at jiu-jitsu pants, sometimes those are going to be a little different. I'm not going to get into all the differences there. This is the pair of pants that came with my Fuji gi, right? So these accompany the top that I just showed you. And yeah, you'll see a tag here in the front. So if you've never seen anything like that, that's very common with martial arts uniforms. And again, you have, in this particular case, it's like a flat shoelace sort of drawstring thing. And they're not even in this case. I have more pulled out on this side, but I would basically tighten them up around my waist, however tight I need them, and then I loop it through this little loop in the front, and then of course I could just tie it off, and I tend to kind of secure it around my waist there. These things do come open during practice. It's one of the kind of running frustrations, and we joke about this a lot. This stuff comes open, but there you go. All right, you will see, I don't know if it'll show on the camera very well. Like I said, sometimes seams come open with pants. I have a good friend, who was kind enough to help me out because I suck at sewing stuff. But sometimes you have to tack down stuff along the waistline. Another reason to be careful with how you wash your uniforms, if you're washing them too aggressively, sometimes too much heat, too rough, or if you're drying them too aggressively, then stuff just wears out sooner. Now, if you're made of money and you can keep replacing your gis, I guess it doesn't matter. But I'm broke, so I try to hold on to these things and keep them working for a while. So that's the basic thing. What you'll notice here, like I said, I was talking about reinforcements up in the shoulders. I didn't go into it in detail. There's also reinforcement kind of around the armpits in a lot of judo gis. Some of that has to do with just where you're typically going to put stress as you move around, and some of it has to do with gripping and all that, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But the reinforcement does have a purpose in many of these cases. If you look at the pants, so this is the front. We're still looking at the front here, that front loop, right in the middle. Well, on the knees, you see this little patch here, just to kind of reinforce for when you fall to your knees, or if you're fighting on the ground and you're already on your knees, kind of scuffling around or whatever, you have a little bit of extra here, a little bit of reinforcement. I've seen some that are thicker than what I have here, but there it is. So, yeah, nothing really particularly special about the pants line here or anything like that with hems. This is just a very basic, simple, fairly cheap judo gi. There's no reason why, at least if you're getting them at wholesale prices, you should have to spend more than, I think, $50 or $60 for a gi. 70 tops, I'd say. There are ones that are way more expensive. You can get these really high-end gis. I've seen jiu-jitsu gis especially that can run into the $200-300 range. And again, nothing wrong with getting those if you have the money and you want a particular thing, but these are perfectly fine. And I actually like this brand. I like Fuji for a lot of reasons. Colors. I also have my white gi here. This was, I've had this one a little bit longer, but I put about the same amount of mileage probably on both of them. I may have even put more on this blue one. But you have blue, let's put this over here, you have blue and you have white as the two traditional colors. Are there other colors you'll see? Absolutely. Especially if you have maybe a less traditional judo program. A lot of really hardcore old school judo programs or judo schools will only have white gis, but you see blue a lot, partly because of competition. So whenever you go to a competition, to differentiate between people who might have the same rank, and especially if they look the same, then you definitely need a way to tell them apart when they're fighting and doing whatever. It becomes a mess. Well, people will either wear 2 different colored belts, or they'll wear 2 different colored gis. So one person is in white and one person is in blue. So if you watch competitions and you see that somebody's always in white, somebody's always in blue, that's why. It's so they can tell them apart. So those are the 2 typical colors that you will see. Again, there are judo programs that use other colors. Black gis, or I've seen some beige or tan ones. You can, if you're really cool like Jean LaBelle, you can wear a pink one. That's a cool story you should look into. Judo Jean LaBelle with his pink gi. But typically, blue and white are the most traditional ones that you're going to see. And those also correspond to a more traditional belt ranking system, though I'm not going to get into the history of ranks and all that right now. But that's enough about the gis. As for the rank system, nice little segue there. What do we have? Well, if you're familiar with formal Eastern martial arts, you're probably familiar with some kind of a belt system. If nothing else, if you watch martial arts movies or you've just heard about this stuff in popular culture, then you've heard of the black belt, right? Which in many cases is perceived as an expert or somebody who's amazing, who's a ninja, right? That's not really what it is. Though in some martial arts, you have to be really good before you ever get a black belt. In other arts, it's way more lax. So there's a variation in terms of the mileage. There's a variation in terms of the rigor, both between arts and within arts. So it's harder, I would say, to get, say, a judo black belt than it is to get a black belt in, okay, I'll say this from my personal experience, in Taekwondo. I've done judo, at least on and off, for the last 10 or 11 years. I did Taekwondo. Now, I was very dedicated, and I worked really hard, but I got my first degree black belt in Taekwondo in about 3.5 years. I would say that by the time I get my black belt in judo, I will be more competent relative to the field of people out there than I was in Taekwondo when I got my first degree black belt there. And I'm a 3rd degree black belt in Taekwondo now. Again, that can be another conversation or another video if people at all care about hearing about that story. Anyway, belt ranks. As is very common, things start at white belt. White belt is usually your beginner belt. I have this little this display. I didn't set this up for this video. I already had these on this rack. It's something I got from my judo club. But this kind of shows a progression here. I kind of like this little thing. So at the bottom we have white belt. So when you first start training, you're going to be a white belt in most typical programs. And then after your first promotion, which generally can be anywhere from 2 or 3 months up to maybe 6 months in, if you're going, say, at least twice a week, mileage varies. I'm speaking in big generalities here. There are going to be exceptions. But after some number of months, typically I'd say between 3 and 6 months, depending on the progression of that program, you learn some basic techniques and you demonstrate them, or you satisfy criteria in some way, depending on that particular school or program, and you get to your yellow belt. By the time you've done yellow, you're probably starting to do randori, which is where you're sparring a little bit more frequently. You may have started at white belt. Not all programs do. But randori is essentially free sparring, where you're trying to apply the individual techniques you've learned on the mat, you've learned in class. You're trying to apply them kind of in real time, continuously, against a resisting opponent. And I can talk more about that another time as well. Then you get to orange belt. So typically you've been doing it. It's common, a year to a year and a half, you get to orange belt. It can be quicker, can be longer. I know some people who didn't get an orange belt until like 3 years in. Right? So again, it varies. And then from there you go to green. By the time you get to green belt, generally what I've seen is that you started to develop a little bit of your own style. You're starting to slip into certain preferences. You've probably been doing this for 2 or 3 years, if not longer. And you've spent enough time that some of your fundamentals are pretty good now. You've probably also by this time developed some bad habits, and that's a fun conversation to have. But you're starting to try to make the art your own a little bit. And you are at the top, I would say at the top of will often be considered junior ranks. You've been around long enough that you can probably help the white belts out with stuff, but at the same time, you're far, far, far from an expert. You're still working on things. I mean, you're always working on things no matter what your rank is. But at green, that's typically when you have enough kind of, probably enough practice and enough background, enough exposure and mat time, that you're starting to form some understanding of this stuff that is meaningful and that you can pass on to other people in some meaningful, real way. And at some point after this, you will then test up again, and the next rank is brown belt, which is where I am right now. So I don't have a black belt to show you, at least for judo. I didn't bring my taekwondo black belt. I figured that would be kind of tacky to use that as my example here. But you move up to brown belt. And brown is, like I said, the other ones were kind of beginner belts. I guess I would say that brown is sort of this intermediate belt because, let's see if I can do this without it falling down. Brown is where you start to, probably start to have some responsibilities, and some of those bad habits that you probably have accumulated by the time you get to green, some of those are becoming a problem, hopefully. And if you're in a good program, in a good club, a good school, they're hopefully trying to iron those out and trying to train you back out of those. And your understanding is starting to deepen out of necessity, because now, as a brown belt, you're being looked at as somebody who's starting to have responsibilities to your club or your school. You're probably helping to instruct white belts at this point. If not, it's on the horizon. Or you're starting to become a pretty heavy competitor by this point. The emphasis depends on the school. It varies a lot. That's a conversation for another time, as I've said half a dozen times in this video. But you're being expected to be an example now. By the time you've gotten your brown belt, if not before, you have an image. The image of your club or your school is now somewhat relying on your actions and your behaviors. So, at least in my mind, it's pretty important to take that seriously. Recognize that you're going to be an example and a mentor to people. Whether you like it or not, you're at least setting an example. And so there's a lot of pressure at this point. And I've talked to some seniors, and they kind of joke about this as being a very common thing, that at brown belt, it's a really, really rough, especially the first rank of brown belt, Sankyu, which is where I still am. We'll see if I maybe promote soon to the next level. But at Sankyu, which is the formal Japanese word, it means third kyu, so it's the third rank down from black belt. You start getting pressure. You're getting pressure from below because, like, the green belts want to see if they can take you on. You're getting pressure from above because the black belts want to keep you humble. And so you're just getting squeezed, and there's always pressure because people are asking you questions. The junior ranks are starting to rely on you to help them with stuff. So there's a lot of growth that happens here. I can say that just in the last 6 months, I've come through a lot of growth. And I flipped off the camera there. I've gone through a lot of growth just by wearing this belt and trying to face the responsibilities that come with it. As I mentioned, well, this is the third rank down from black belt. So what's above this? Well, you have 2 more ranks of brown. So you stay at brown belt for a long time in traditional judo progressions. By the way, everything I'm saying here is specific to adult programs. You will see a couple other belt colors often in judo programs that deal with kids or deal with junior ages, so below the age of about 16. It can vary a little bit depending on the school. But for those people, instead of brown belt after green, there would be a blue belt and then a purple belt and then a brown right at the top just before they get to black belt. Whereas for adults, you just wear a brown belt typically for all 3 of those ranks. So there's sort of a third kyu down. You want to call it a third class brown, second class, first class, or however you want to think about it. So there are different levels. So on this little display that I showed you, you would have white, yellow, orange, green, brown, 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 black. And then you have different levels of black. So there are different Dan ranks, D-A-N. So those refer to black belt ranks, and they are referred to typically by numbers. Shodan is the first one, for example. Nidan is the second, and so forth. So there's some counting in Japanese that is classically or traditionally associated with these things. But anyway, that's an introduction. to the uniform that we wear, the judogi, and the rank system such as it exists in many, I'd say most traditional adult judo programs that you're going to see. There's a ton of variation out there. I'm not trying to say that this is the only way it should be or can be, but this is what is often traditional and kind of the classic version. So hopefully that clears things up if you were curious about that. Maybe I ran a little too long, but I wanted to give a thorough introduction, if that's a thing. Maybe that's an oxymoron, but there you have it. Again, I'm at brown belt right now. We'll see if I promote to the next level of brown in the near future. If I'm able to stick with this, which I hope to do. I imagine that someday I will be a black belt. But I'm in that intermediate area where I'm starting to have a lot of people rely on me to help them, and I'm trying to step up to the plate. And in fact, that's part of why I even started my channel. So this is part of my journey. This is part of my process. I hope you found that useful. I hope you found that helpful, interesting in some way. And I'll try to talk about some other aspects of judo and other martial arts in my experience and a number of other things. So stay tuned for all that. Hopefully you got something out of this. Until next time, take care.